So I hear the senators asked him a lot of questions about China, yeah? Yeah, oh, he answered them well. A lot of detail, huh? What? A senator said he was taking advantage of them by having more knowledge on the subject matter? What the what? He was taking advantage of them by having more knowledge on the subject matter. I got nothing. Okay, yeah. June 10th, 1951. What's happening this week? Everyone is talking about ceasefires, about negotiations. The Canadians, the Norwegians, the Indians, even some of the Americans. Everyone. Oh, wait. Not the North Koreans, the Communist Chinese, or the Soviets. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, Dean Acheson was questioned in the MacArthur Senate hearings. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a unifying mission directive, and the war in the field continued with the UN forces holding the initiative. At the end of last week, U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet's Operation Piledriver kicked off, but it did so in ground that had been turned to mud by heavy rains, and those rains, in fact, continued until the 5th. The Chinese resistance inside the Iron Triangle, aided by the weather, is pretty stiff, preventing any real advances beyond a crawl. But then the last couple days of the week, they finally give way and begin a withdrawal, though a phased one, heading northwards in battalion-sized formations. So between yesterday and tomorrow, the advancing UN forces reach positions along the Wyoming line. On the 4th, from Ned Alman's U.S. 10th Corps, coordinated attacks by U.S. 1st Marine Division and ROK, South Korean 5th Division, begin towards the Kansas line and the Punch Bowl, like 10 kilometers north of them. Already by then, though, the 3 divisions of ROK 1st Corps heading up the coast have reached their part of the Kansas line, a high ridge north of Route 24. Here's the thing about 10th Corps' advance. The 6-mile attack to the Punch Bowl involved General Alman's forces in some of the most difficult conditions of combat. In some areas, sharply pitched axial ridges limited advances to extremely narrow fronts. In others, repetitions of steep transverse ridges forced assault troops to make arduous climbs and descents over and over again. The 2 main arterial roads through the Sochon River Valley in the west and the Soyang River Valley in the east were heavily mined. Other access roads, the few that existed, winding through the mountains, were narrow and required substantial engineering work before supply trucks could use them. Spates of rain frequently caused landslides that blocked the roads, or so slickened them that trucks skidded off at hairpin turns. That's just on the ground. Rain and fog limit aerial observation and support. And the biggest problem of all is the KPA, the North Korean defenders, well organized on each and every ridge, and who do not voluntarily give ground, and pretty much always counterattack after losing a position to try and retake it. So Almond widens his attack, the 8th, throwing in the ROK 7th Division above the eastern part of Hwachon Reservoir, as the Marines try to take the lower edge of the Punch Bowl and the section of the Kansas line to the southwest along the Sochon River Valley. Marine Commander Gerald Thomas throws in his reserves the 9th, but though the ROK 7th Division reaches the Kansas line today the 10th, the Marines and ROK 5th Division are nowhere near their objectives. You remember, at the end of April, when the Chinese offensive was in full swing and ROK 6th Division basically collapsed twice over just a few days, I wanted to say a bit about that division, well, ROK divisions in general, and I haven't really had the time. Now, when that happened, 9th Corps Commander William Hogue didn't single out Divisional Commander Chang Do-yong for censure, though he called the division's conduct disgraceful in all its aspects. He didn't want to single him out and make him a scapegoat, and he thought him one of the better ROK commanders. The problem was lack of leadership and control on the part of all grades of officers and non-commissioned officers had caused the division's disintegration. With exceptions that only prove the rule, deficient leadership indeed continued to be the major weakness of the ROK Army. ROK Chief of Staff Chung Il-kwon talked to 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet and told him this leadership problem comes from a lack of training, which sure, is true in terms of traditional military education. They don't have much. But Van Fleet counters this by pointing out that Rock 6 has performed just fine at times in the past, and making a good officer is not a question of just giving him good military skills. To quote Mossman again, a high sense of responsibility, devotion to duty, physical and moral courage, and the will to fight for homes and families were fundamental to military leadership. These were the attributes, he emphasized, that, along with training in military science, had to be developed among South Korean officers and non-commissioned officers if the ROK Army was to be a capable and dependable force. Away from the chaos it created in the field, the timing of the ROK-6 collapse was a really bad thing for South Korean President Syngman Rhee's plan to build up the ROK Army. See, on April 18th, the ROK representative to the UN asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff for arms and supplies to outfit 10 more divisions of ROK troops. Then the first collapse happened, and after that, and only a few hours before the second one, Rhee sent a personal request for the same thing. In general, it's an appealing idea to Washington, because it would be great if ROK troops could eventually replace the American ones. But both UN Commander Matt Ridgway and Van Fleet are against it. Well, against any immediate increase. They just do not think it possible that as long as there is heavy fighting, American personnel could be spared for training and supervision. And of course, they say again, the problem is the need to develop competent leadership, not just get more men under arms. And indeed, it is the prerequisite before enlargement. Putting together new divisions without competent leaders would be a huge waste of equipment. So Ridgway, Van Fleet, and also Ambassador John Muccio gave their refusal to Rhee. And the message is very blunt. Basically, from the Minister of Defense down to the smallest unit in the field, ROK leadership is inadequate. And until this obvious weakness is addressed, they won't hear any more talk of equipping more divisions. Ridgway asked Van Fleet last week for his appraisal of the current situation and his recommendations for operations the next 60 days. This week on the 9th, Van Fleet responds. He says, as he said before, that in spite of the beating the enemy has taken lately, they should recover enough the next 2 months for at least one strong offensive. Obviously then, he has to focus on a strong defense, and he says the best place for that is the Kansas-Wyoming lines. First of all, if he were asked to occupy a line further north, the next place where the terrain would even allow a strong line of resistance from coast to coast is over 100 kilometers to the north. Advancing that far would likely mean taking a lot of casualties. It would also shorten enemy lines of communication and supply, which would make it harder for UN air power to hit those. Not only that, the air power has destroyed so many of the bridges, railway lines, roads, and whatnot in North Korea that UN engineers would have an enormous task setting up the logistics. So that's what Van Fleet thinks. But what about the guys higher up? I've talked before about the changing situation in the field being ever more to the UN forces' advantage in terms of bringing about a ceasefire. But here's the thing. President Harry Truman has been opposed to any direct appeal to either the Chinese or North Korean top brass, since they might interpret such an overture as weakness and refuse to talk. The idea is to try to draw out an offer from them by maintaining such pressure on their armies that they'd realize they can't win, and by showing UN willingness to end hostilities somewhere near the pre-war border between North and South Korea. I talked last week about Dean Acheson using the MacArthur hearings to sort of broadcast the U.S. position, but there are other players involved here. There was a request in the U.S. Senate by Senator Edwin Johnson to ask the UN to call on all belligerents to cease fire at 4 a.m. June 25th, which is the exact one-year anniversary of the outbreak of the war. The Senate did not take action on this, but the Indian delegate to the UN brought up Senator Johnson's proposal in the General Assembly and reminded everyone what Ridgway had said back on March 12th, that if the war ended with the UN forces controlling only the territory south of the 38th parallel, it would be a great victory. On May 20th in the Soviet Union, Pravda pointed at Senator Johnson's proposal to show the U.S. was getting tired of the war. On May 26, on the UN radio show The Price of Peace, Canadian Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs Lester Pearson said the objective in Korea is not the complete defeat of the enemy, but the defeat of aggression against South Korea. UN Secretary General Trygve Lie said pretty much the same thing last week on June the 1st, speaking in Ottawa. If a ceasefire could be arranged along the 38th parallel, then the main purpose of the security resolutions of June 25th and 27th and July 7th will be fulfilled, provided that a ceasefire is followed by the restoration of peace and security in the area. But are there any responses from North Korea or China, or anyone, to all this? Well, there weren't. In late May, the Swedish delegate to the UN said that a Soviet source had said that the war could be ended if the pre-war border was reestablished. But then the Soviet delegate to the UN, Yakov Malik, said that was baloney. Funny enough though, it is actually Malik who does give the first sort of positive response. The State Department asks George Kennan, a State Department official who is an expert on US-Soviet relations, to arrange to meet Malik. Kennan is to make very clear the U.S. desire for a ceasefire. This meeting happened May 31st. Kennan brought up the subject, and Malik didn't give him a real answer, but says he needs to consider the matter, which means talk to Moscow. They talk again this week on the 5th, and Malik says the Soviets want a peaceful Korean solution as soon as possible, but it would be inappropriate for them to take part in negotiations. He advises Kennan to approach the Chinese and North Koreans about it. I will give some more detail about this next week. Also the 5th is a meeting in Washington between representatives of all the UN nations who have forces in Korea. They choose to tell Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong and Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai their position on a ceasefire through neutral diplomats in Peking. So that is where we stand as the week ends in terms of a possible armistice. But let's get away from the UN and go back to Washington and the MacArthur Senate hearings. If you'll remember, last week Secretary of State Dean Acheson asked for a day off to prepare a statement about official U.S. policy towards China since 1945. This was because of a barrage of questions and accusations that served only to confuse everybody. On Monday, June 4th, he is ready to deliver a 3-hour performance. Speaking with notes, he told of the disintegration of China's ancient society under the impact of a modernizing society and of the unsuccessful attempts of the United States to mediate the competing forces of nationalism and communism. He flatly rejected any American fault for the collapse of the Chiang government. American aid, he said, could not ensure the survival of any government, could only supplement its own efforts, nor could the United States make decisions on behalf of another government, even one it was attempting to salvage. He also summarizes recent Chinese history and American involvement, which I will also do, although if you really want the full story, you can check out the 4-part series we did on the Chinese Civil War in our War to War series over on our Time Goes History channel. Anyhow, he paints a picture of 1945 China with the Soviets and Chinese communists in Manchuria, the Japanese holding the coastal areas, many cities and rail networks, and the Chinese nationalists sprawled across the southern part of the country. The American study mission sent over concluded it would take years of fighting for the nationalists to defeat the communists, and the odds of winning weren't all that good anyhow. George Marshall was sent in to try to negotiate a ceasefire and get Chiang to institute reforms designed for broad mass appeal, but he failed. Congress voted $400 million in aid be sent, but would not send military advisors into combat areas. Even with the money, by 1948, the nationalists began collapsing, and a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers turned into 1 to 1.5 against. In January 1949, U.S. intelligence said the situation was hopeless, and David Barr, the head of the U.S. military mission, even said the nationalists had the world's worst leadership. Something like 80% of the American military equipment had been lost. The U.S. decided it didn't want to take over the war, and so Chiang lost and headed for Formosa. That is Acheson's summing up of things. By the way, although you can find the MacArthur hearings written about in many sources, my favorite one is that Joseph Golden book I quoted, Korea, The Untold Story. it really covers the Acheson part especially well. I like that he even points out one of the reactions from one of Acheson's adversaries to all of this, Senator Owen Brewster, who says that Acheson is taking advantage of the senators by having greater knowledge of the subject matter. I don't even know how I would respond to that. The rest of his testimony, which ends yesterday the 9th, is mainly a defense of the Truman administration and a rejection of MacArthur's plans to widen the Korean War into general war with China. He thinks actually that China has sabotaged its own best interest. Strategically, Acheson felt the Chinese had blundered by entering the war because it cost them almost certain conquest of Formosa, which was now beyond their grasp indefinitely. No longer did the world consider Formosa leftover business from the Chinese Civil War. Much of the world now viewed China as an international outlaw. Nor would China have any voice in the Japanese peace treaty, as it might have anticipated had it kept out of Korea. And China had forfeited any immediate hope for a UN seat. Those are the downsides for the Chinese, but there are upsides for the US as well. First of all, they'd shown the world that they really do live up to their commitments to other nations. Also, the American people had been against a rearmament campaign, which to prepare for future conflicts with, say, the Soviet Union, the administration thought necessary, but there was much support for it now. Acheson says he feels the Korean conflict has brought home to people the great extent to which the whole world is subject to danger. The questions continue and dip into a wide variety of subjects, many of which are not related to MacArthur or China or Korea, such as those about lending money to Mexico to develop the oil industry there. When it's all finally over, here's another Dean Acheson quote. He is asked what he's going to do that weekend, to which he responds, "I have a plan that will test my capacity for the consumption of alcohol. And if another war erupts before I finish, it must be waged without my services." Great line. But the week is over, so who knows how that plan worked out. I'm optimistic. This was a week of Acheson talking about China, everyone hoping to get a reaction from one of the communist countries, and slow advances in the field. Moscow indicates the US should talk straight to China or North Korea. That's what the UN did, and what Truman wants to avoid. I mean, even winning big in the field lately, it's not like they're having an easy time this week. The enemy still has a lot of war-making capacity. Will they respond about negotiations at all? When? How? Why? So many questions that I just don't have answers to. Keep watching, and one day we'll get them. In case you've been in the field yourself and haven't seen, as I said, we did a 4-part mini-series on the Chinese Civil War on our War to War series on the Time Ghost History channel. You can check that out right here. And all of that content and this content is made thanks to the Time Ghost Army. And you too can join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Andries van Jaarsveld is the Time Ghost Army Member of the Week for this channel. That's a great name. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.